Dr. Matthews Grant, welcome to Think for Christ.
Hey, thanks very much for having me.
Well, since this is your first time on the channel, could you just take a minute to introduce yourself to the Think for Christ community?
Sure, yeah. I teach philosophy at University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm not originally from Minnesota, never thought I would actually, live and settle here. I originally grew up in the Southeast in Atlanta, Georgia. But as things go in philosophy, you go where the job is, and actually it's been a great place to live and a great department to teach in. I have great colleagues here. I didn't go to college thinking I would be a philosopher or a philosophy professor. But I ended up there, after taking philosophy classes as an undergrad, and then went on and did my doctorate at Fordham University. And then this St. Thomas is my first and very likely probably my last, sort of full-time philosophy gig. So it's been a good spot.
Great. Well, Matthews, I think it's safe to say that when it comes to the question of divine and human agency, the prevailing view among Christian theologians and philosophers, not to mention, I think, just the average Christian layperson, is that it's a zero-sum game. In other words, the more agency that God exercises over my will, the less agency I have. So it seems like we have to make a choice here. We have to either choose to uphold God's universal causality and diminish human freedom, or we have to choose to uphold human freedom and diminish God's causality. But in your book, Free Will and God's Universal Causality, you deny that such a choice has to be made. You argue that by embracing what you call the dual sources account, we can resolve the conflict between human freedom and divine causality without diminishing either. So in a moment, I'll ask you to unpack the dual sources account for us. But first, I think it's important to get clear on the scope and nature of divine and human agency that you're seeking to reconcile in this book. So if we could, let's start off with divine agency. You want to defend the traditional classical notion of what you call divine universal causality. So what does it mean, Matthews, to say that God is universal cause? And why should we be committed to this traditional classical Christian view of divine agency?
Sure, yeah. So to say God is a universal cause is to say that he's the source and cause of all that exists, of all being distinct from himself. That is, you can make it a little more precise. You could say for any entity, anything that has sort of positive ontological status that is not God, that is not identical to God, God is the cause of that entity, and he's the cause of it. He's the direct cause of it, and he's the cause of that entity for however long it exists. So at any time that an entity distinct from God exists, God is directly bringing that entity about. And that is, I think, the traditional theistic views, the traditional Christian view. So you can find it in major figures of the Christian theological philosophical tradition, like St. Augustine, St. Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, and many others. And when you look at even contemporary philosophers, even ones who, at the end of the day, think that God's causality and human agency are in a kind of zero-sum game, as you described earlier, even ones who I think hold that sort of view, when they're just characterizing what theists and Christian theists in particular have traditionally held, they will typically include God's universal causality among those items or among those doctrines. Okay, and for me, that's one reason to take it seriously just by itself, right? Its traditional standing within traditional theism, within Christian theism. We need to have a pretty good strong reason to give that up, in my view. And I haven't seen that case to be made. I think we should give it the benefit of the doubt at the very least. And maybe one reason to accept God's universal causality as traditional standing. I think it's not a surprise really that it has this traditional standing, because I think there's a strong case that can be made from Christian scriptures for divine universal causality. So now, I mean, granted, the correct interpretation of Scripture on any number of matters is a complicated. It's a complicated matter, right? It's controversial, but Scripture declares God to be the creator of heaven and earth, obviously. Declares in various places that God is the maker of all things. Says that all things are from God and through God, right? And so if we take all things, quite, at face value, it seems like that everything, at least everything other than God, is going to be brought about by God. Someone might think, well, we're talking here about substances and not the actions or operations of those substances. That's what Scripture is referring to. So maybe God is the cause of and sustainer, source and sustainer of me, but not of my actions or operations. Maybe God is the source and sustainer of the fire, but not the fire's act of, heating the water. Okay. But in fact, Scripture seems to attribute the operations and effects of natural causes to God. Not in a way that seems to dismiss that the natural causes are themselves genuine causes, but in a way that attributes them to God as well as the natural causes, and the works of human beings. I should say not only good ones, but sometimes bad ones are attributed to God in Scripture. And so there, I think, is of course, Scripture, isn't a work of metaphysics. It doesn't spell out the doctrine of divine universal causality in the sort of the neat and metaphysical way that I was earlier, but it's that doctrine seems to be a very economical way of interpreting the various things that Scripture seems to say about the relationship between God and everything else other than God. So maybe it's not so surprising, given that people who look to Scripture as an authority thought that God was the universal cause. But it's not just that. There are various cosmological arguments for God's existence seem to have as their implication that there is a single first being, God, who is the source of all that exists distinct from himself. So if we take these arguments seriously, if we think they could be sound arguments giving us good reasons to believe in God's existence, then we need to accept the various implications or ramifications of that. And I think divine universal causality is arguably one of them. I'm not a huge fan myself of sort of perfect being methodology, where you can sort of roll out the divine attributes just by rolling out what you consider to be, the various great-making properties. But since that seems to be a popular way of approaching the attributes by many, certainly many contemporary philosophers of religion, there's a case to be made through perfect being methodology for God's universal causality. Certainly, St. Anselm thought that there was, right? It seemed to be something such that nothing else could exist unless it was made by you. Seems to be a great making property. Anything that has that property or that attribute would seem to be greater than something that doesn't, all things considered. Anyway, so there are lots of reasons it seems to take divine universal causality seriously. It seems that we should reject it. We should be loath to reject it. We should reject it only if there's a really sort of very, very powerful reason to do so.
And as you say, a part of the doctrine is not only that God causes all the entities that are distinct from himself as substances, but also all of their properties, all of their accidents, and all of their activities. And as we'll see, that's going to come into play as we talk about your dual sources approach here. So let's turn now, and if we could talk about human agency. What makes your book so bold and unique is that you're seeking to reconcile this strong traditional account of divine causation with a robust libertarian account of human freedom. So talk to us about the libertarian view of human freedom. What does it mean on this view for an act to be free? And how does it contrast with a compatibilist account of free will?
Sure, yeah. So, people could mean slightly different things by free will, I think of it, and this isn't to say everything there is to say about it, but I think of it as a power that we have to intentionally perform acts that are ultimately up to us and within our control. Um, um, Acts, at least some of which, where we could have done otherwise than we did, all prior conditions remaining the same. So acts such that though I raise my right arm, given all the same antecedent conditions, I might have refrained from raising my right arm, or I might have raised my left arm instead. Okay. I That I think is kind of the common sense conception of free will. I think that's arguably what we experience ourselves, the power to have when we act freely. And it seems to be a kind of power that is incompatible with what we might call a universal determinism of events, or at least of determinism of events involving human beings, or a determinism of human actions. So, and that's what the libertarian is going to say, or incompatibilist about free will and determinism in general are going to say that that freedom is incompatible with determinism. And the libertarian is one who is an incompatibilist who affirms human freedom and therefore rejects determinism. Okay, so now a compatibilist, by contrast, would be one who thinks that freedom and determinism are compatible. So you could be a compatibilist who affirms free will alongside of determinism. All right. But why think that they're incompatible? I tend to think that they're incompatible because I tend to think that determinism rules out our actions being up to us, and our actions being such that we could do otherwise, all prior conditions remaining the same. So let me talk a little bit about determinism, because that's going to be important for the conversation, I think, that follows. What does determinism mean? First of all, like a lot of words in philosophy, it could take on different meanings. So some people might use the word determine is more or less synonymous with cause. Something that brings about X, determines X. Okay. That is not the sense of determinism, though, that I think is relevant for these debates, these conversations in free will. Okay. Determinism is the way it gets used in free will discussions is a much more narrow and specific idea. It's the idea that, to put it this way, you could say an event is determined in this relevant sense if there are factors or conditions or events that are both prior to the determined event, and that are logically sufficient for the determined event. So let me say what I mean by prior and what I mean by logically sufficient here. So by prior, I have in mind not primarily temporal priority, but causal or if explanatory priority, if those are different. So factors or events that are causal or explanatorily prior, even if they're not temporally prior, and that are logically sufficient. What I mean by logically sufficient, one thing is logically sufficient for another if it's not possible for the one to obtain or hold or occur without the others obtaining or holding or occurring. Okay? So a determined event is one in which there are causes or explanatory factors of that event such that it's not possible for those prior causes to obtain and the event not occur. All right? So now let's apply that to human action. If all my acts are determined, it means that for every single one of my acts, there are causes of those acts, prior factors of those acts that for which it's not possible that my act not follow from them. It's not possible that those things be in place, that those things obtain or occur, and my act not follow. Determinism holds that all my acts are determined in that way. And if that's the case, it looks like that there are going to be acts of mine that simply follow, that are simply, as it were, the necessary consequences of factors that are beyond my control. And if my acts simply follow from factors that are beyond my control, it's hard to see how my acts themselves are in my control or up to me. And it's certainly hard to see how I could have ever done otherwise than I did in the same prior conditions. And so the determinism is incompatible with what I think is sort of the common sense conception of our freedom, the one that I would like to uphold. And so I have incompatibilist intuitions and therefore libertarian intuitions about freedom.
My own theological tradition is Protestant Reformed, and it's been popular, especially in the modern period, for those who are Reformed and who uphold strong view of divine sovereignty and providence, to go in for a compatibilist view of human freedom. Because as you say, and you can see very influential writers like even Jonathan Edwards, who embrace a kind of compatibilism, because as you say, it seems like there's a conflict here. And as I said a moment ago, and as you write in your book, the predominant view today is that we cannot adhere to both divine universal causality and to a libertarian account of human freedom, an incompatibilist account of human freedom. That is, it's widely believed that if God causes our acts, then those acts cannot be free in the libertarian sense. Mm-hmm. So Matthews, help us understand what is supposed to be the conflict here, and then why you believe that a traditional view of divine transcendence and the creator-creature distinction is the key to resolving this conflict.
Yeah. And so let me just say, I have read, in folks who hold compatibilist views of this sort of thing, coming either from the Reformed tradition or, the Thomistic or Augustinians. My intuitions are incompatibilist about free will, but there's a massive literature on this.
Oh yeah,
including literature. You couldn't read it. At least I couldn't at the pace that I read. If that's all I did for the rest of my life, probably. So, there's including literature from compatibilists who argue against the various incompatibilist arguments like the ones I was just sketching out.
Yeah.
Now I can't. I haven't dived deeply enough into all of that to just sort of write off compatibilism,
sure.
As impossible or absurd. Because my intuitions are incompatibilist, I think it's useful to see if we can uphold all those traditional theological positions, even on incompatibilist grounds. And I think even people who are even philosophers who are themselves happy with compatibilism, I think should be interested in that project, because
for sure.
Then they can bring even potentially even sort of their friends with libertarian intuitions on board with the traditional theology. So
yeah, anyway, it's always best to have multiple options.
So I think I throw that out there, but why have so many thought that God's universal causality and related claims is incompatible with libertarian freedom? So I think it's largely rooted in how they think about God's causality. So I think it's because they understand God's causal agency in such a way that for God to bring about some effect, including to bring about a human act, is to introduce some factor that determines that act. That is, to introduce some factor that is both causally prior to, and logically sufficient for that act. So they think of God's causality in such a way where it's not really possible for God to cause my act without determining it, right? Among the things God can't do, we might say God can't make, a square circle or something like that, or bring about something that involves a contradiction. Among things God can't do, even though to me this doesn't seem to involve a contradiction at all, but still, God can't bring about my act without determining it. And that follows, I think, directly from the way they think about what it is for God to cause something. So, what do they think? Well, I think that they think, and this is again to put it fairly generally, that when God brings about some effect, he does so by means of some tertium quid, some third thing, if you will, that intervenes, as it were, between God and the effect that he brings about. He brings it about by means of some third thing that is explanatorily downstream from God, but explanatorily upstream, and therefore prior to the effect that he brings about. So what sort of thing? Well, I think that there are a couple of different common things and sometimes you could think that it's one or the other of these, or you could think that it's both. So some think that God brings about effects by his choices or decrees, where these choices or decrees are understood to be explanatorily, causally prior to the effect brought about. So now, and I think this is part of the reason for thinking this way. And I call these ways of thinking about, I sometimes call these ways of thinking about God's agency is the popular model of divine agency, because it seems to be one that's sort of popular, floating around about. And I think one of the reasons it's popular is it tends to model God's agency very closely on certain aspects of our agency. So I raise my right arm. We might think that I first choose to raise my right arm, and then my choice to raise my right arm, or I first form an intention to raise my right arm, and my intention or volition is that by means of which my arm goes up, or it's really the choice to raise my arm that is what's actually causing the arm to go up, and I cause it by means of the choice. Okay, and that may be the case for some of our actions, right? Well, if we then shift that to the divine case, right? You think, well, God brings it, God, and bring about some effect E. He first chooses to bring about E, or decrees to bring about E, and then E is brought about. Okay. Now, notice that choice is causally, explanatorily prior to the effect, right? That he brings about, and it also seems very plausible to hold that it's impossible for God to choose or decree to bring about some effect, and yet that effect not obtain. So this divine decree or choice also would seem to be logically sufficient for the effect, and so we've got this factor that's introduced when God brings about an effect that determines it. It's prior to and logically sufficient for the effect God brings about. And so if the effect in question is my action, it means that my action is determined. Okay. So one tertium quid here on sort of the popular model might be thought of as God's choice or decree. Another might be just God's causal act itself. So some people might think that God causes his effects by means of his causal action, where his causal action is something that is a kind of tertium quid between God and the effect, by means of which the effect we're talking about is brought about. And this also models God's agency on some sorts of human agency. So I might cause the ball to fly through the air by swinging the bat. Okay. So the swinging of the bat is that by means of which I cause the effect of the ball is flying through the air. The swinging of the bat is you might even say that my action of hitting the ball or causing the ball to fly through the air is my action of swinging. We could get into discuss the details, but I mean, you see the point, right? There's a tertium quid. There's a kind of prior action, my action of swinging, which then caused the effect of the balls flying. Well, you might think of God's action, causal action, in the same way as something that it's actually prior to, and that by means of which God brings about his effects. But again, it seems very plausible that if you posit God's act of bringing about some effect, that the effect simply follows. It's not possible for the one to obtain without the other. And so if you think of this act as causally prior to the effect, then you've now introduced some factor that determines the effect. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is explain why it is that many have thought God's universal causality is incompatible with libertarian freedom. And the reason is, I think that they think of God's causality according to a model on which for God to bring about some effect is to introduce some factor that determines it. And so on that way of thinking about God's agency, if God is the universal cause and therefore the cause of all our actions are determined. And so none of them can be free in the libertarian sense. And so you're either going to have to deny freedom altogether, or you're going to have to accept an incompatibilist account of freedom.
Yeah. So you're talking about a certain view of causal agency that would imply something being introduced that would be both prior to and logically sufficient for an act. But even to take a step back, and I think we'll circle back to what you call the extrinsic model, because that's such a key aspect of your book, this view of divine and human agency, really. But just to take a step back to this transcendence question, I think one of the problems that we struggle with when we think about divine agency, human agency, the way that God relates as creator to us as creatures, is that it just seems to be part and parcel of the way we think as human beings to bring God down to our level, to conceptualize God's causal activity as if he were a creature. And once we do that, it's just inevitable, isn't it, that we're going to see a problem, because it's true to say that if any creature caused my actions, right? If any creature caused my choice, that choice would not be free. I think we would both probably agree with that choice would in fact be determined. But the problem is, God is not a creature, right? Mm-hmm. He's the transcendent creator. Mm-hmm. And so one of the issues is we can't just infer from the fact that some creature causing my act would make that act unfree and determined. We can't infer from that the creator causing my act would also make that act unfree. I want to say right there, that's an invalid inference. Yeah. Taking as a model the way creatures interact with each other and kind of pasting that onto the model and using it as a model that kind of regulates the creator-creature relationship. Yeah. Michael, and the problem here, like I said, if your view of God is too small, and this, I think, is really the problem. Our view of God is too small. If our view of God is too small, I think we're going to see that there is like an intractable problem between divine sovereignty and human freedom, or divine causality and human freedom, because it becomes a zero-sum game. Michael Dodds has a great illustration. I'm not sure if you've read this one, Matthews, but he gives the illustration of two men lifting a boat, right? So if two men go to the backyard, they're going to lift this boat to put it in the water. Yeah. Each one contributes to the task, right? Each one bears part of the weight of the boat. Yeah. And if you have two people who are, relative in their strength levels, they're going to be bearing about 50% of the weight, right? But if you introduce into this illustration one person that's way stronger than another person, then the amount of work that one person's doing is going to be, disproportionate compared to the weaker person. Now you can imagine that, what if you had Thor lifting the boat with you, or the Incredible Hulk, right? At that point, it's like the work that you're doing as a human being is almost nil. You're almost doing no work. And this is the way a lot of people approach God. They think of God as if he's like a Norse god or Zeus or this super powerful angel, or what have you. And if that's your view of God, then of course the idea that God causing you to act is going to seem like it just completely empties the human being of all causal agency. It seems like God's doing all the lifting on that illustration. So, and it seems to me what you're doing in your book, Matthews, is you're rigorously developing and defending an account of divine and human agency that takes as its principle this traditional classical view of divine transcendence, right?
Yeah.
And you call your account the dual sources account, but really you're just working from this basic principle of the creator-creature distinction, right? And divine transcendence. And then you add a corrective element in terms of how we think about causal agency too, with this extrinsic model. So anyway, that's my thought about the transcendence question, but I'll get out of your way. If you just want to develop the dual sources account a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, and there are a lot of different things one could say about the way transcendence connects here and helps reconcile. I do think that the popular model, the one that introduces that tertium quid, and so God's causing something, introduces a factor that determines whatever he causes in the relevant sense of determines, right? I think that is the result of a kind of anthropomorphic, as you were suggesting, sort of thinking about God's agency. And, it's not, this gets into sort of more expansive conversations about how we think about God and how our language applies to God, because it's not that we can't apply any of the concepts that we apply to our own action to God, but we also have to engage in some apophatic theology, the negative way, some thinking about the ways in which God and therefore God's agency is necessarily going to be different from ours if God is what we take God to be. So anyway, I think when you reflect on that, and maybe this will come up a bit later in the conversation, you have reasons for denying these anthropomorphic models, like the popular model. But let me just say on transcendence, there's lots you could say there, but one thing is it seems like any view on which it's just not possible for God to bring about an effect without rendering that effect determined is a view that I'm suspecting hasn't sufficiently appreciated God's transcendence. So why don't we get into maybe the dual sources account?
Yes, for sure.
You invited me to, if this seems like a good time. And as as a listener may be anticipating, the key here is going to be to offer a different model, a different account of divine agency than the ones that cause the problems. Okay. And so that's really central to the account is what I call the extrinsic model of divine agency. It's a model on which for God to bring about an effect doesn't introduce some tertium quid, doesn't introduce some third thing that is both prior to and logically sufficient for the effect he brings about, and so doesn't bring about anything that determines that effect. So let me talk a bit about this. Now, this is there are a lot of pieces to it, so I'll try to talk through it slowly. Stop me at any point if you think that would be helpful. But for some, you can read about this, and that may be it's sometimes an easier way to take some of it in. But on the extrinsic model of divine agency, what is it for God to bring about some effect? What does that consist in? Well, it consists simply in the effect with its relation of causal dependence on God. Okay? So God's causing some effect. God's causal act is just the effect qua dependent on God, or with its relation of dependence on God. This is actually a very old way of thinking about causal agency. It goes back to Aristotle, okay, who is thinking about this completely independent of any concerns about theology, okay, which I think is an interesting point. When you ask Aristotle, where is an agent's causal act? Where is the causal act of some agent, say fire, when it brings about heat in water? Where is that? The popular model thinks of the agent's causal act as something in the agent or something in between the agent and the effect brought about. Aristotle says, no, the act of the agent is actually in the patient. It's actually the heat in the patient, the water, insofar as that heat depends on the fire. And so the location of the causal act is actually to be found, as it were, in the effect, not in the cause of that effect, the agent of that effect. But on the extrinsic model, then for God to bring about some effect is, what does that consist in? It's simply the effect with its relation of dependence on God. Now, if that's how you think about a divine causal act, if there's no prior divine decree or volition by means of which the effect is brought about, if the divine act of bringing about the effect is not some tertium quid that is prior to the effect brought about, if the divine causal act just is the effect with its relation of dependence on God, then there's no prior determining factor that gets introduced on this model. And I think one way to see this is by going through the various items involved when God brings about an effect on the extrinsic model. Okay, so what are those? There's God. Okay, so he's clearly involved. He's clearly on the scene when he brings about an effect. Okay, so you ask yourself, is God prior to the effect that he brings about? And the answer is, of course he is. He's the cause of that effect, and so he's prior. He's causally prior. Any cause is going to be prior to its effect, right? He's causally prior to its effect. So God's prior. Is God logically sufficient for his effect, right? Does the very existence or obtaining of God entail or necessitate that his effects exist? And the answer to that question is, at least in my view, of course not, right? God was free not to create or to bring about whatever effects he brings about. And so God is prior but not logically sufficient. So we've just identified one of the items involved when God brings about an effect, and we've noted that item doesn't constitute any determining factor. It doesn't constitute anything that is prior to and logically sufficient for the effect. So let's talk about the effect itself, right? And sometimes maybe we'll just say that the effect in question is some act of mine. Okay, is my act logically sufficient for my act? And I think the answer is, of course it is, right? It's not possible for my act to exist or obtain without my act existing, obtaining. So my act is logically sufficient. Is my act prior to my act? Of course not, right? So my act, another item involved in this picture, in this story, is not prior and logically sufficient. What about the causal dependence relation between God and my act? Well, maybe it's logically sufficient for my act, but it's not prior, right? Relations are not prior to their relata, okay? So the causal dependence relation is not something that could determine my act. What about God's act of causing my act? Okay? What about God's causing of my act, his act of causing it? Well, what does that consist in on this model? It consists in my act with its dependence relation on God. So God's act of causing my act partially consists in my act, and nothing can be prior to that in which it partially consists, right? So God's act of causing my act, God's causing my act, is not prior to my act. A lot of people get hung up on that. they somehow read that and sometimes think, wait, are you saying that you can have causes that aren't prior to their effects? That's absurd. Am I saying that there are any causes prior to? What's the cause here? The cause is God. God's
right.
prior to the effect. The cause on the extrinsic model of the effect of my act is not God's causing. It's not God's act of causing my act, right? That is not prior on the extrinsic model to the effect caused. God doesn't bring about the effect by means of his causal act, where his causal act is some tertium quid, some crank, some lever by which God brings about the effect. You could say God brings about the effects in his acts, but not by means of them, where these acts are understood to be prior to them. And so God's act of causing some effect is not the cause of the effect. It can't be, because it's not prior. God's the cause. Okay.
Right.
What about what do we want to say about on the extrinsic model about God's willing or choosing? Because I do want to say that God wills and chooses his effects. But that willing and choosing is not something, that is prior to the effects brought about. Rather, we can say that God is willing and choosing his effects because he's bringing about them on purpose or for a reason, right? And I think it's sufficient for saying that something has willed something, that it's brought it about on purpose or for a reason.
Sure.
When God brings about his effects, that act of bringing about the effect is also an act of willing it, right? Because he's bringing it about on purpose. He's bringing about it with intention for a reason. So he's willing it. We could also add that his act of bringing about is choosing it, because he's not only bringing it about on purpose, but he could have done otherwise than bringing it about. So we could say he's choosing it. But notice then that since his willing and choosing the act or the effect, whatever he's bringing about, since his willing and choosing it just is his bringing it about, and since his act of bringing about is not prior to the effect, neither is his willing and choosing it prior to the effect. And so just as God's act of bringing about the effect does not introduce a determining factor because it's not prior, neither does God's willing or choosing the effect. And neither does God's reason for bringing about the effect, because God's reason for bringing about something is consistent with his not bringing it about. Right? That reason doesn't necessitate his bringing about. He can have reasons for bringing about all sorts of things that he doesn't bring about. And so the reason is not logically sufficient for the effect. So I've just gone through all of the items, as it were, on the scene, as I sometimes say, involved when God brings about an effect on the extrinsic model.
Right.
And none of the items is prior to and logically sufficient for the effect, for the act. And so none of them determines the effect.
None of them determine the effect. Yeah. And I would just, for some listeners, some viewers, this may seem like an odd way to understand human agency, but I just want to point out that it's not like you're creating this extrinsic model out of thin air. It's not like this is just ad hoc. You're just not postulating this simply to solve the thorny issue of divine and human agency. But rather, as you said, this view of agency per se, even human agency, goes all the way back to Aristotle. The action of the agent is in the patient. The cause is in the effect. Mm-hmm. And even today, as you point out in your book, action theorists talk about basic actions, right? Mm-hmm. Where there are actions that we take that we just cause immediately, right? There's some basic actions that we're involved in where there is no intermediary. Like there's some things that we do that we don't first form an intention to do, right? Yeah. Or first make a decision to do. So for example, when I'm driving a car and I stop at a red light, I don't first form an intention to stop at the red light, right? The intention to stop at the red light is in the stopping at the red light. It's in the effect. It's in the action. So there are acts that we take, basic acts, where our intending and our willing and the reasons for the action are not some intermediate between us and the effect, but actually just occur in the effect or in the doing of the action. Again, action theorists call this basic action. So I just want to point out, this is not Matthew's ad hoc, extrinsic model of agency. This is actually a model of agency. I think you've coined the term extrinsic model, correct? I don't think I've ever seen that. Yeah, but the model that you're leaning on is just Aristotle's view that was taken up by the scholastics and is propounded by action theorists today.
Yeah, I think the extrinsic, I came out, and the idea, the reason for the name is just that it doesn't locate the divine causal act. It doesn't locate it in God. It doesn't identify it with the divine substance or God himself. It doesn't identify it with any accident in God. Rather, the divine causal act is extrinsic to God. And I think this is, the general point about agency, the act of the agent is in the patient, goes all the way back to Aristotle, who's talking about this without any theological concerns at all. But I think arguably, these things are a matter of some interpretive debate perhaps, but arguably you find the extrinsic model in Aquinas, or certainly
I think so.
It's certainly inspired by things that Aquinas says. And it's not, so there are these interesting points, like it's not like it's a view on which divine agency is wholly unlike in all respects from creaturely agency, because as you're pointing out, Anthony, there are aspects or elements that would hold even of human agency, even of arguably of just natural agents or causes in the world. It's
analogous, yeah.
A divine causal act on this model is a basic act. That means to say it's an act that is brought about, but not by means of bringing something else about prior to that, right? So if I cause an email, how do I do it, right? Well, the way I do it is by typing fingers, moving fingers on a keyboard, right? So I have to first, as it were, bring about the motion of my fingers on the keyboard. I do something, and it's in virtue of doing that I cause the email. Okay. So is my causing an email a basic act? No, it's an act by means of it's a non-basic act, because it's an act. It's an effect that I bring about by means of bringing about some prior effect. And on these popular models of God's agency, it seems like they understand all of God's causal acts to be non-basic.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm thinking that God's causal acts are basic. They're things he brings about without bringing about anything else necessarily. Now that there's some, and I don't want to get into it. I don't want to take us too far afield. There's some nuances and discussion that would need to be had there, but there's takes to some of the relevant points of similarity and difference.
Yeah. But the way you view divine action is going to have massive implications on the way you view the attributes of God, or what God is like, because if God, in order to cause some effect in the world, if there is something intrinsic in God that has to be involved in that action, then it seems like for God to cause different worlds, say, means that God would have to be intrinsically different relative to those different worlds. But one of the things that you point out is the extrinsic model is also kind of entailed by a divine universal causality on the one hand, but also some other central tenets of classical theism. One of those is divine simplicity. And then the other one is the fact that although creatures are really related to God, God is not really related to creatures. Yeah. So can you just talk about that? I know those are huge subjects. Sure. I understand those are huge subjects, but can you talk about how the extrinsic model fits with those classical views of God?
Yeah, and so let me maybe focus a bit on divine simplicity here. Okay, so div- and as you say, this is a huge, that in and of itself is a huge topic. I think a very interesting and important one. You know, at its core, divine simplicity is the claim that God is not a composite. God is not composed of parts of any sort. Not Now, not physical parts of any sort, um, but not metaphysical parts either. Now, the idea of a metaphysical part will be, maybe is probably going to be unfamiliar, to folks who, non-philosophers and maybe even to some philosophers, depending on their formation. But philosophers have often thought of things as having what we might call metaphysical parts. So in sort of the classic, Aristotelian's classic tradition, things like matter and form, uh, substance and accident, um, essence and existence would be examples of metaphysical parts. In contemporary metaphysics, something like properties would often be thought of as a kind of metaphysical parts. They enter into the metaphysical makeup of things. If properties inhere in some sort of subject or substratum, the subject would be thought of as a sort of metaphysical part. Okay, so the idea is that God can't be made up of anything if he's the first and primary being, and if he's a being that is a se, that he exists just of and from himself and doesn't depend on anything else
Yeah.
for his existence. Something that is composed of parts is something that seems to depend on those parts for
Yeah.
its existence. It seems arguably to be posterior to those
That's
parts,
right.
but at the very least, it's something that is not prior to those parts, right? Those parts would seem to be co-primary with the thing that is composed of them or by them. But theists want to hold, at least traditionally, that God doesn't depend on anything
That's right.
apart from himself, that he's the uniquely primary being. There's nothing that is even co-primary with God. And if all of that is right, it seems like God is going to have to be simple.
That's right.
Okay, not composed. Now, um, classical philosophy has understood the intrinsic attributes or properties of a thing, um, what they call accidents, to be metaphysical parts
Right.
that are part of what enter into the metaphysical makeup of the thing, of the object in question. Okay, and so and I think similar sorts of things probably are said sometimes, and I think probably need to be said by contemporary metaphysicians who may talk in a certain and different language, but talk about properties and so forth. Anyway, how does all this relate to our topic? Well, um, so an accidental property, a property that a thing has which is distinct from itself, uh, it would enter into the composition of a thing, but nothing can enter into the composition of God.
That's right.
And so it looks like, given this way of thinking, divine simplicity, God isn't going to have any intrinsic attributes or properties, distinct from God. Okay, one way of putting it. All right. In other words, God isn't going to have any accidents. Because accidents would enter into composition with God, which would make God a derived thing, and God's not a derived
A dependent thing. He
A
would no longer be
dependent thing.
dependent. Yeah.
He would be dependent. He would not be primary, uniquely primary. Lots of problems. Okay, this is why the mainstream of the theistic tradition, certainly the Christian tradition, has affirmed divine simplicity. Okay, well, if that's the case, then um, the only thing that is intrinsic to God is the divine substance, or God
That's right.
himself. That's the only entity intrinsic to God. Even the persons of the Trinity, right? Even though they're three and not one, they are all numerically the same entity, the same divine substance. Okay. So, but let's put the Trinity aside. So for now, what is a divine action going to be if it's not extrinsic to God? If you say that the divine action is intrinsic to God, your choices are either to say that it is identical with the divine substance, or that it's an accident in God,
right?
An intrinsic accident. Okay, well, but it can't be an intrinsic accident because that violates divine simplicity and makes God a derived, dependent being, etc. Okay. All right. Well, what if you say that it's not an accident in God, but it's identical with the divine substance? Well, now you're saying that God's causing me and causing this universe, that just is the same as God, that it's identical to God. And so if that's the case, it doesn't look like God could have done otherwise than create this universe, right? And so it seems like you inevitably have to give up on divine freedom, the idea that God was free in creating. No, God had to create just in virtue of being God. And the
pre-philosophical intuition that you're not a necessary being, and you're a contingent being.
That too, right? So if you as we traditionally do, take God to be a necessary being, and to be God just is to create this universe, then this universe and all of us in it are necessary beings as well.
We're necessary beings, yeah.
So if you take God to be necessary, it generates a modal collapse where it looks like everything else is necessary. If you take, and it also seems to violate divine freedom. Okay, so
those are problems.
God is if you think God's causing is an accident in God, it violates divine simplicity. It violates God's aseity, his lack of dependence. If you think it's identical with the divine substance, then it generates a modal collapse and is incompatible with divine freedom. So what do you need to say? You need to say that God's act of bringing about things and willing things, creatures for that matter, you need to say they're extrinsic, right? So we have a strong motive for adopting the extrinsic model of divine agency, which is completely independent of its usefulness in reconciling God's universal causality with creaturely freedom. So the reason to endorse the extrinsic model, you might say, is overdetermined. We've got multiple reasons for wanting to affirm it.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if your view of God is that when he causes some effect, something internal to him changes, and that God would be internally different across different possible worlds because he creates different possible effects. As you point out, there are some high costs that come with that view. It's the popular model. Yeah. It's the one that's overwhelmingly advanced by philosophers of religion, Christian philosophers, and theologians. And I think one that's probably held by just a lot of Christian lay people. But man, is it costly.
It's costly. Yeah. It is costly. And I think that those costs are coming more to light. And so frankly, I think that sort of view is, my sense, although I could be wrong about this, is that it may be in retreat a bit. But I don't know. But I think divine simplicity at any rate seems to be making a comeback where, maybe 30, 40 years ago, at least within contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, people sort of laughed and chuckled at it. The sort of objections that they raised, I think, have admitted of pretty good answers, right?
Yeah. As it turns out, they were answers that were already provided by guys like Aquinas.
They were answered by already provided, but these folks that were raising these objections, didn't really know in any serious way. And these are including some very brilliant philosophers of religion that I respect a lot, like Alvin Plantinga,
William Lane Craig. Yeah.
William Lane Craig. I mean, William Lane Craig, seems to still persist in some of this, despite the fact that he seems to me to have it is, well, all the premises, or at least many of them, that he needs to that should lead him to affirm divine simplicity. He's a strong proponent of God's aseity,
in necessity,
and anti-Platonism about this, that, and the other. So, yeah, but there's still hope, right?
Yeah. Well, Matthews, let's so that's the extrinsic model.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this notion of dual sources. One thing I don't think we've talked about yet is the idea that in any act, because God is the universal cause, in any human act, God is also acting. But we want to be careful, because we're not saying that the idea isn't that God contributes something and you contribute something, and the parts together are what equal the act. It's not like the sum of God's contribution and my contribution that equals my act, right? So can you talk about what it means to have two sources for one act, and how this is traditionally understood?
Yeah, so I mean, I call it the dual sources account. I think it's just handy to have a name, but because what it wants to affirm is that there are, in fact, two sources of my act, your act, of human acts, of creaturely acts in general, but two sources. Like, I'm the source of my act, and God is the source of my act, and that my act is ultimately up to me. It's also ultimately up to God, and it is in a way that satisfies all the standard conditions for libertarian freedom. Okay. And again, back to the comment you were making early on, a lot of people think that sourcehood is a zero-sum game, that ultimate responsibility is a zero-sum game. If something is ultimately up to God, it can't be ultimately up to me. If it's ultimately up to me, it can't be ultimately up to God. And what I want to say is no, it can be both. And so that's where the name comes from. So, I mean, why think my act is ultimately up to God? Well, God is the source and cause of the act, of my act. That's a good reason to think that. God is the source of and cause of my act. And though he brought about my act, he could have done otherwise than bring it about. All prior conditions remaining the same. That is, all conditions prior to himself, which is just himself, right? Remaining the same. God could have refrained from bringing about my act. So it seems to me that whether or not my act occurs is up to God, right? It's within God's control. But it's also up to me and within my control, because given the extrinsic model of divine agency, even though God causes my act, I could have done otherwise than I did. All prior factors remaining the same, all antecedent conditions remaining the same. If I perform some act purposefully and intentionally, when I could have done otherwise, all prior conditions remaining the same, I mean, I think that's sufficient reason to think that the act that I just performed is ultimately up to me. And I think that satisfies standard conditions for an act being ultimately up to an agent. So I think it's ultimately up to me as well. Is it possible that you have a case where God brings about my act and I not perform my act? Of course not. Those things couldn't come apart, right? So that I have the power to, I could have done otherwise than perform my act. Had I done otherwise than perform it, then of course it would follow that God didn't cause my act, right? But it's still the case that whenever I do perform my act, that act is ultimately up to God as a cause and source of it, and ultimately up to me. And that's what I want to argue in the dual sources account. That's why I give it that name.
Great. Anything else you think we need to add just to kind of fill out the dual sources account, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that covers the basics.
Okay.
Surely I'll 5 minutes after we, we stopped the conversation. I'm like, I should have added that, but yeah.
Well, I'm going to put the link, the Amazon link to your book in the description of this video. And man, if you are listening now and you are at all interested in this subject, man, I just encourage you to go get this book. It's one of the most profound books I have read. I told Matthews in the green room that I have worked my way now 3 times through this book. I have read this book 3 times. That's how profound and important I think it is. And there's so much more that you do in this book. One of the things that you do is not only is it well argued, but you anticipate the strongest potential objections to the dual sources account, and you deal with them exhaustively. So let me just, with a little bit of time that we have left, let me just ask you this. To your mind, Matthews, what do you think is the strongest objection to your account? And just briefly, how would you respond?
Yeah. Well, and I'm afraid now I may not go brief enough. So let me just stop me if you need me to, slow down or stop it. I haven't come across any objections yet that I thought were that couldn't be answered pretty successfully, plausibly. Okay, I've seen some objections are really bad objections based on a misreading, like people who say, well, this account is absurd because it thinks it says that there can be causes that are not prior to their effects. I talked about that earlier, right? They see me say that the God's act of causing an effect is not prior to the effect, and they because they think God's act of causing act is the cause of his effects, and they see me saying it's not prior. They think that that's what I'm saying, even though I explicitly deny that God's act of causing an effect is the cause of that effect. These people are not reading carefully enough, probably because they start off not very sympathetic to the conclusions, and so they hastily, right. Some have thought that they've objected to the extrinsic model because they think that it makes the existence of God's effects ultimately inexplicable, right? They think because, say, God brings about some effect E, since God could have been intrinsically the same even without bringing about E, right? That means that we haven't really accounted for why E exists rather than not. Okay.
Sure.
Do you understand what
this is a classical, this is a classical argument against libertarian freedom.
Well, so that's one point I want to make. So I'm like, this is especially in sort of dialectical context where I'm writing here, and largely for people who have libertarian intuitions about freedom. Like, if you're a libertarian, you're already committed.
You're already committed
to this. Okay. Moreover, how are you going to solve this problem, right? You're either going to have to solve it by saying that the divine substance itself necessitates his effects, in which case you've given up on divine freedom and you've got modal collapse and all that. Or you're going to have to posit some contingent divine accident or volition in God, or some contingent divine action in God, and then you've just relocated the problem. So why does God, so if you say, well, God, this effect exists because God chose for it to exist. Okay, well, why did God choose for it to exist?
Why did he choose for it to exist?
Rather than many other effects that he might have chosen to exist. You've just pushed back the problem, the alleged problem, rather than solving it. So I understand the objection, and at least those objectors at least have read, I think, and understood what the model is saying. But I'm not ultimately impressed by the objection or persuaded. An interesting,
and you're not saying that things happen randomly.
No.
What God does, even though it's not intrinsic to God, he still does it for reasons. And as long as he does it for reasons, then you have an explanation for why it's done.
Yeah, and it's no more random than our free acts are random.
That's right.
There's an interesting pair of objections that Roger Turner and Jordan Wessling a pair of articles. That one article argues that the dual sources account succumbs to a theological version of the consequence argument, which is an argument that is used against determinism, the compatibility of determinism and free will. So even though my view claims to be a deterministic, they say that it still succumbs to this. And another, they argue that dual sources doesn't really accommodate ultimate responsibility. And I think these are interesting and objections and potentially serious ones. I don't, in the end, think that they're successful. So I have an article in the journal Philosophia that is fairly recent that responds to these. Folks might be interested in. One thing that that article also does is it provides like a nice, succinct summary of the dual sources approach. So if you're like, we're looking for just, something that sets it out, much of what I've talked about here, but sets it out in, 7 or 8 pages, and maybe even manuscript pages. The actual journal pages maybe even shorter than that. It does that, and then it responds to some of these objections.
Well, if you send me that link, I can include that also in the description of the video as well.
Okay, yeah, I could do that, and then the book itself. One of the things it does is that may be of interest to some of the readers is it applies some of these. Well, it deals with with questions about the evil, God's relation to evil and all this. Is God the cause of sin? Which are difficult. I mean, in some ways, difficult or challenging questions. I mean, they're going to be difficult or challenging, I think, for anyone who holds a very robust account of
that's right
of providence. So I mean, and like I think most people, who espouse that and ultimately think that that's the right view. Like, yeah, sometimes, I mean, sometimes those are challenging, to sort out, and but it makes those applications. But it makes applications also to some other theological doctrines like providence, grace, predestination, even. So if you're curious how you could affirm sort of robust accounts of providence, grace, and predestination that are not Molinistic, but is consistent with libertarian free will. The book basically applies the core, which we've talked about, to handling those issues.
Yeah, and in my opinion, there are so many thorny theological issues that can be resolved, or at the very least dissolved, by the dual sources and the extrinsic model of divine agency. So the book is worth the read just for your explanation on how we deal with theological questions like grace and predestination and divine providence. The big ones you've mentioned, I think, from a theological perspective, is going to be, well, if God causes all substances, all entities, including all their actions, and what about sin? What about moral evil? And these are huge questions that we can't deal with right now, but you deal with them exhaustively to my mind in a way that's intellectually satisfying in your book. So the book's been out now for six or so years. So the final question, Matthews, is just for my own curiosity: how has it been received? I mean, it's so tightly argued. It's such a good. It's just so well argued, so well presented. I'm just curious, how is it being received out there in the academic world?
Well, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, for one thing, like people are, I think, paying attention to it, which you never really know when when you publish something in philosophy, whether more than 2 or 3 people will read it. I do think people are reading it and hearing about it. I know of a number of people who are persuaded by it, convinced, who like it quite a lot, and then there are others who have raised objections. So I mentioned a couple. There've been some things in print that are both sympathetic to it, draw on it, build on it in various ways, and others that have been critical, and some of which I've tried to respond to. I mean, there are folks who think that the whole idea that one effect could be brought about by two distinct causes is sort of incoherent. So, and that's something that I try to address in the book. But obviously, if somebody thinks that, that's another kind of objection, right? So they think you either have to embrace occasionalism, where the only cause is God and creatures don't really bring anything about, or you have to say that no, God maybe just sustains creaturely causes, but creaturely causes are solely responsible for the effects that they bring about. So I think I think it's generating discussion, which is all you can ask for. I mean, and maybe there's some fatal flaw in it that I haven't seen. I mean, I really tried to think up all the objections, the best objections I could, and respond to them. But it doesn't mean I've thought of every objection.
Well, getting objections to your work is, at least in the realm of philosophy, right? It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It means that your work isn't being ignored. And that's right. The worst case scenario, is for your work just to be ignored. Sure. So, Dr. Grant, many thanks for spending time with me today. It's been a real joy.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.